Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. It was the winter of 2019, just before the holidays. My parents had left to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary at a cabin in the mountains. As their only child, I was 17 and tasked with watching our house for the long weekend. Their instructions were crystal clear. Absolutely no friends over and definitely no parties. The house better look exactly the same when we return, my dad had warned, giving me that look that said he meant business. Of course, being the rebellious teenager I was, I nodded solemnly and promised to follow every rule. But the second their car disappeared down our long, winding driveway, my phone was already in my hand, calling my girlfriend. She was just as excited as I was about having the place to ourselves for the weekend. For context, I grew up in rural Montana, where our nearest neighbors were over a mile away. Our property backed up against national forest land, with nothing but dense pine trees stretching for miles behind our house. In winter, the isolation felt even more pronounced, with snow blanketing everything and transforming the landscape into an eerily silent white expanse. My girlfriend Layla arrived Friday evening around 7, bringing with her a small bag of weed she'd gotten from her older brother. It was our little ritual whenever we got time alone. We decided to smoke outside despite the cold. No way I was risking the house smelling like marijuana when my parents returned. We bundled up in heavy jackets and made our way into the trees behind the house. The sun had already set, leaving only the faint blue glow of twilight filtering through the pines. Fresh snow had fallen earlier that day, and our boots crunched loudly with each step. "This spot looks good," I said, stopping in a small clearing about 200 yards from the house. We could still see the warm yellow glow of the windows through the trees, like a lighthouse in the darkness. We shared a joint, laughing and talking as snowflakes began to fall again. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could see our breath forming clouds in the air. We were leaning against a large pine tree when Layla suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I listened intently, but heard nothing except the soft hiss of snow falling through pine needles. "Probably just a deer," I reassured her. She shook her head. "No, listen." It sounded like footsteps. We both fell silent. Then I heard it too, the unmistakable sound of snow crunching under weight, somewhere deeper in the trees. My heart rate quickened. "Let's head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting too cold anyway." As we turned toward the house, Layla grabbed my arm and pointed. Through the trees, about 50 yards away, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving parallel to us. In the dim light, all I could make out was that it was a person, definitely not an animal. "Who would be out here?" Layla whispered, her fingers digging into my arm. "Probably just a hiker who strayed from the trail," I said, though even I didn't believe that. No one hiked these woods at night, in the middle of winter. We quickened our pace, no longer concerned about the noise we were making. As we approached the house, I glanced back over my shoulder. The figure was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Once inside, I made sure to lock every door and window. Layla was visibly shaken, but I tried to play it cool, suggesting we make hot chocolate and watch a movie to distract ourselves. I convinced her and myself that what we'd seen was probably nothing to worry about. We settled on the couch with blankets and put on a thriller. In retrospect, not the best choice given our already frayed nerves. Outside, the snowfall intensified, and the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house. Halfway through the movie, the power flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness. Perfect timing, I muttered, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. "Do you have candles?" Layla asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Yeah, in the kitchen." "Stay here." I made my way to the kitchen, using my phone's light. As I was searching through the drawers for matches, I heard Layla gasp from the living room. "What's wrong?" I called out. "Jackson, come here." Now her voice was barely audible. I hurried back to find her standing by the large picture window that overlooked our backyard and the forest beyond. She pointed silently. At first I saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I spotted them, footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the forest directly to our house. And they didn't stop at the window. They continued around the side toward the back door. "Someone's been watching us," she whispered. My mouth went dry. "It's probably just my footprints from earlier," I said, though I knew it wasn't true. These were fresh, and they definitely weren't ours. I was about to suggest calling the police when we heard it. A soft, metallic scratching sound coming from the back door. Someone was trying to pick the lock. "Get down," I hissed, pulling Layla to the floor behind the couch. The scratching continued, followed by the distinct sound of the door handle turning. My parents kept a baseball bat in the hall closet for home protection. I crawled toward it, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Bat in hand, I crept toward the kitchen. The scratching had stopped, but now there was a new sound, a slow, deliberate tapping on the kitchen window. Tap, 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 3 careful knocks, as if whoever was out there wanted to be invited in. I reached for my phone to call 911, but to my horror, found that the battery had died. Layla's phone was still in her purse, in the kitchen, just feet away from where the intruder was trying to get in. The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then came the sound of glass breaking, not a window, but the small pane in the back door that would allow someone to reach in and unlock it from the inside. I had seconds to act. Gripping the bat with sweaty hands, I shouted as intimidatingly as I could. "I've called the police. I have a gun, and I will use it if you come in." The silence that followed was deafening. Then we heard the crunch of footsteps retreating quickly through the snow. Layla and I remained frozen in place for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek through the kitchen window. In the yard, illuminated by the moonlight that now broke through the clouds, was a single set of footprints leading back toward the forest, and something else. There, stuck in the snow beneath the kitchen window, was a small piece of paper. The next morning, after a sleepless night huddled together on the couch with the bat between us, we ventured outside. The paper was still there, now damp from the snow. I picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it. Written in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "You dropped this in the woods, and beneath it, Layla's driver's license, which had indeed been in her wallet the day before. We called the police immediately. When they arrived, an officer informed us that there had been several reports of a stalker in surrounding counties who followed young people home from public places and watched them for days before attempting to break in. They'd never caught him, and he'd never left anything behind until now. My parents returned early when they heard what happened. Surprisingly, they weren't angry about Layla being there. The terror in our faces was punishment enough, my mom said. We never found out who the person was. The police increased patrols in our area, but no arrests were made. The only consolation was that the fingerprints they lifted from Layla's license were now in the system. I still live in Montana, but not in that house. And I never go into the woods alone anymore, not even in daylight. Because sometimes I still get that feeling of being watched, of eyes following me from between the trees. And I can't help but wonder if someday I'll find another note waiting for me. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. In the summer of 2015, I spent a week at my grandfather's lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota, while my parents were finalizing the paperwork on our new house in the suburbs. It was my third night there, a Thursday, when one of the most violent thunderstorms I've ever witnessed rolled across the lake. The weather report had warned about possible severe weather, but nothing could have prepared me for what came that night. The sky erupted with what seemed like 5 or 6 lightning strikes per minute. Each one followed almost immediately by deafening thunder that shook the windows of the old cabin. The rain came down in sheets, pounding against the metal roof like thousands of tiny hammers. I've always found storms exhilarating rather than frightening. There's something primal about huddling safely inside, while nature unleashes its raw power just beyond your walls. So instead of going to bed at my usual time, I stayed up in the small living room, reading a mystery novel by the light of an old kerosene lamp that my grandfather kept for emergencies, which turned out to be fortunate, since the power had gone out around 9 o'clock. The novel was particularly engrossing, a classic Agatha Christie that I'd never read before, and I lost track of time until I finally finished the last page just after midnight. I set the book down, stretched, and was about to head to bed when I heard something strange over the constant drumming of the rain. It was a distinctive scraping sound, like metal against metal, coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it might be a loose shutter or piece of siding being whipped around by the wind. But there was something deliberate about the rhythm that didn't match the chaotic patterns of the storm. I waited, listening carefully, and sure enough, about 30 seconds later, I heard it again. This time, I was certain it was coming from the direction of the boathouse, a small structure built partially over the water at the end of a short dock. The sound was faint but distinct, even through the storm, a metallic scraping followed by a dull thud. My curiosity overcame my better judgment. Grandfather had always warned me never to go outside during electrical storms, but I wasn't planning to venture far. I just wanted to peek out the window of the sunroom, which faced the lake and had a clear view of the boathouse. The sunroom was dark and chilly, with windows on 3 sides that were now streaming with rainwater. I approached carefully, trying not to trip over any furniture in the darkness. As I reached the largest window, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire property, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a figure, definitely human, crouched beside the boathouse door. The person was dressed entirely in dark clothing, with something covering their head, possibly a rain poncho with a hood, and they appeared to be working at the padlock on the door with some kind of tool. Darkness returned as quickly as it had lifted, and I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The boathouse contained not only my grandfather's fishing boat, but also several expensive tools and equipment. I knew instantly that I was witnessing a break-in attempt. I backed away from the window as quietly as possible, then hurried to the kitchen where my grandfather kept an old landline phone, one of those models that works even when the power is out. My cell phone had no reception at the cabin, so this was my only option. I was about to dial 911 when another brilliant flash of lightning lit up the yard. I glanced instinctively toward the kitchen window and nearly screamed. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale and distorted by the rainwater streaming down the pane, but unmistakably staring directly at me. Our eyes met for that split second of illumination, and then darkness swallowed everything again. I dropped to the floor, crawling away from the window, no longer caring about being quiet. I scrambled to my grandfather's bedroom, practically falling through the door. "Grandpa," I shouted, shaking him awake. "Someone's trying to break into the boathouse. They're outside the kitchen window now." My grandfather was remarkably quick for a man in his 70s. Within seconds, he was out of bed, pulling on his robe and reaching for the rifle he kept mounted on the wall. He handed me a heavy flashlight. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his voice calm but serious. "If I tell you to run, you lock yourself in the bathroom and don't come out until I say it's clear." We moved through the cabin, my grandfather checking each room methodically. When we reached the kitchen, he signaled for me to shine the flashlight out the window, but there was no one there. Just sheets of rain cascading down the glass. "Could have been a reflection," he suggested, but I could tell from his tone that he didn't believe it. We continued to the front door, where my grandfather paused with his hand on the lock. "Stay inside," he ordered. Then, before I could protest, he flung the door open and stepped out onto the covered porch, rifle at the ready. I watched from the doorway as he surveyed the yard, rain pouring off the brim of his hat. Another flash of lightning revealed the empty lawn stretching down to the lakefront, and the boathouse with its door now standing ominously open. My grandfather saw it too. He motioned for me to stay put and began making his way toward the boathouse, moving with a hunter's careful stealth despite the downpour. I lost sight of him as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the range of my flashlight. The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I stood in the doorway, straining to see or hear anything beyond the relentless storm. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw the beam of my grandfather's flashlight bobbing back toward the cabin. He was soaked to the bone when he returned, his expression grim. "Someone definitely broke the padlock," he confirmed. "But they're gone now, probably heard us coming and took off. Nothing seems to be missing, thankfully." We spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch, the rifle always within reach. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blue sky that seemed to mock the terror of the previous night. In the daylight, we examined the boathouse more thoroughly. The padlock had been expertly cut with bolt cutters, and there were muddy footprints on the dock, at least 2 different sets, suggesting more than one intruder. But strangely, nothing had been taken, despite the valuable equipment stored there. It wasn't until we returned to the cabin that we discovered what the intruders had actually been after. The kitchen window, the same one where I'd seen the face, had been carefully pried open from the outside. If I hadn't stayed up late finishing that mystery novel, if I hadn't heard those sounds from the boathouse. The local sheriff told us later that there had been a string of similar break-ins at vacation properties around the lake, but most had resulted in much worse outcomes: complete ransacking and significant theft. In our case, it seemed the intruders had been using the boathouse break-in as a diversion, planning to enter through the kitchen while attention was focused elsewhere. My grandfather had the locks changed and a security system installed the very next day. He praised my alertness, saying that my city instincts had probably saved us from a much worse fate. But I still couldn't shake the memory of that pale face in the lightning flash, eyes locked with mine through the streaming glass. I finished out my week at the cabin, but I never again stayed up reading during a storm, and I made sure every window was securely locked before sunset. Some nights I still dream about that face at the window, illuminated for just a heartbeat by lightning, before vanishing into the darkness of the storm. I've always been fascinated by thunderstorms since childhood, and my 6-year-old daughter Emma shares this passion. There's something primal about watching nature's raw power unfold from a place of safety. Whenever a storm rolls in, we retreat to our special spot, a rustic cabin I built on the edge of our property, nestled against the tree line where our yard meets the Adirondack wilderness. The cabin is nothing fancy, but it's our sanctuary. Hand-hewn log walls, a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture salvaged from yard sales, and large windows that frame the spectacle outside. I built it 3 summers ago as a weekend project, never imagining it would become our favorite retreat. That October evening, as the first distant rumble echoed across the mountains, Emma's eyes lit up. "Dad, it's coming. Let's go to the storm cabin," she exclaimed, already pulling on her rubber boots. I grabbed our storm-watching supplies, hot chocolate in a thermos, a couple of blankets, and my old battery-powered radio that crackles with static, but somehow enhances the atmosphere. We dashed across the yard as the first heavy droplets began to fall, reaching the cabin just as the sky opened up. Within seconds, sheets of rain pounded against the metal roof, creating that perfect percussion that makes storm watching so magical. By the time we closed the door behind us, my flannel shirt was already soaked through. I started a fire in the small stone fireplace, while Emma arranged our blankets on the worn leather couch. Through the windows, we could see the storm intensifying, lightning illuminating the dark forest in stark, momentary tableaus, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of our shelter. "This is a big one, Daddy," Emma whispered, clutching her favorite stuffed fox. I nodded, pouring hot chocolate into 2 mugs, as the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin. The storm was moving directly overhead now, the time between lightning and thunder shrinking until they were almost simultaneous. The lightning became so frequent that our cabin was bathed in an almost continuous strobe effect, the forest outside alternating between pitch darkness and harsh, white illumination. Emma loved counting the seconds between flashes, but now they came too quickly to keep track. Our property sits on 15 acres, with dense forest surrounding 3 sides. The cabin faces an open meadow that gives way to those woods, allowing us an unobstructed view of approaching storms. During one particularly brilliant flash, Emma suddenly grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Daddy," she whispered, "there's someone out there." I felt my heart skip a beat but maintained a calm expression. "Where, sweetie?" "It's probably just shadows from the trees moving in the wind." "No," she insisted, pointing toward the tree line maybe 50 yards from our cabin. When the lightning came, I saw a person standing by the big oak. I moved to the window, straining to see through the downpour. The darkness between lightning flashes was absolute, making it impossible to verify Emma's claim. I waited, counting silently, until the next flash came. "Nothing. I don't see anyone, honey," I said, though something about her certainty made the hair on my arms stand up. 3 more flashes revealed only rain-lashed trees and underbrush. Then came an exceptionally bright burst that turned night into day for a split second, and I saw it too. A figure unmistakably human, standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods. Not moving, not seeking shelter from the torrential rain, just watching. "Emma," I said, keeping my voice level, "I need you to run back to the house and tell Mom to turn on all the exterior lights. Tell her to use the security system app on her phone." She nodded solemnly, and I was grateful we had practiced this route many times before, straight across the yard to the back porch, never stopping, no matter how hard it was raining. "What about you?" she asked. "I'm going to wait here and make sure our cabin is locked up properly," I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Go now, quickly." After she disappeared into the rain, I moved away from the window and retrieved the Louisville Slugger I kept behind the door, a precaution I'd always felt slightly foolish about until this moment. I positioned myself where I could see the yard, but wouldn't be easily visible from outside. Minutes passed. The floodlights around our property suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the yard and the edges of the forest in harsh white light. I scanned the tree line carefully. Nothing. I waded through several more lightning flashes, but the figure had vanished. Man or woman, I couldn't tell. But someone had definitely been watching our cabin, and the thought sent ice through my veins despite the warmth from the fireplace. I made my way back to the house, baseball bat in hand, checking over my shoulder every few steps. Inside, I found my wife Sarah already locking doors and windows, with Emma wrapped in a towel at the kitchen counter. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. Emma said there was someone outside. I hesitated, not wanting to escalate the situation, but knowing I couldn't dismiss what we'd both seen. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, but they were definitely there. "Should we call the sheriff?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her phone. I thought about it for a moment. Let's not overreact. It could be a hiker who got caught in the storm and was looking for shelter. Even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. No hiker would just stand there in the pouring rain, watching our cabin without approaching. But all the same, I added, let's keep everything locked tonight and leave the outdoor lights on. We tried to salvage the evening by watching a movie in the living room, the storm still raging outside. Emma eventually fell asleep on the couch, and Sarah carried her up to bed while I double-checked all the doors and windows again. After tucking Emma in, I found myself drawn to her bedroom window, which overlooked the backyard and the cabin beyond. The rain had slackened somewhat, but lightning still flickered occasionally, illuminating the wet landscape. That's when I noticed it. The cabin door was open. I was certain I had closed it when we left. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I stared across the yard. Another flash of lightning confirmed it. The door stood ajar, moving slightly in the wind. I didn't share this observation with Sarah, who had returned to the living room. Instead, I sat on the edge of Emma's bed, listening to the sounds outside her window. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the glass made my pulse quicken. The storm gradually moved on, but my unease remained. I checked the time repeatedly. Minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Sarah eventually went to bed, but I told her I wanted to finish watching the weather report. Instead, I sat in the darkened living room, staring out at the illuminated yard. Our motion sensor camera at the front door pinged my phone around 2 in the morning, probably triggered by wind-blown debris, I told myself, but I checked it anyway. The notification showed a still image from our doorbell camera. It had captured a partial figure moving across our porch, just a shoulder and an arm, the rest out of frame. Whoever it was had managed to approach the house without triggering the motion lights in the yard. I nearly called the sheriff then, but what would I say? That I'd seen someone in the woods during a storm, and now had a partial image of someone. It wasn't enough. I decided to wait until morning to investigate the cabin. Sleep was impossible anyway, so I kept vigil in the living room, listening to Emma's gentle breathing through the baby monitor we still used, and the occasional sounds of the departing storm. When dawn finally broke, I walked across the wet grass to the cabin. The door was closed now, not open as I had seen it during the night. Inside, everything seemed untouched, except for a small puddle of water on the floor that could have dripped from our clothes when we left. As I turned to go, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper tucked beneath one of the mugs we had used for hot chocolate. I unfolded it to find a simple message written in pencil. Beautiful cabin. Beautiful family. See you during the next storm. I never told Sarah or Emma about the note. I installed a security system in the cabin the next day, along with cameras covering every approach through the woods. We still use the cabin for storm watching, but I always make sure my phone is charged. The baseball bat is within reach, and I never take my eyes off the tree line. Sometimes, in the deep stillness between lightning and thunder, I find myself scanning the woods, wondering if our mysterious visitor is out there, waiting for the perfect storm to return. The most terrifying things, after all, are those we can sense but cannot explain. I'm 25, working my way through grad school in a small college town in New England. This happened about 2 months ago, during the first heavy snowfall of winter break. Most students had left campus, and the town had that eerie emptiness that comes when half the population suddenly disappears. I'd been picking up extra shifts, driving for a food delivery app to save up for next semester's books. That night, I'd already been working since noon, but around 11:30, I got restless in my apartment and decided to log back in for a few late-night deliveries. The snow was coming down harder, which meant fewer drivers and better tips. Just before midnight, I got a large order, 3 bags filled with food from an all-night diner on the edge of town. The delivery address was in an area I'd never visited before, about 15 minutes outside the town limits. As I drove, the neighborhoods transitioned from student housing to modest family homes, then to more scattered rural properties. The roads became narrower, less maintained, and the snow was getting deeper with each mile. My GPS directed me down a winding country road that seemed to lead nowhere. The houses became fewer and farther between, until I was just driving through dense woods. I was about to call the customer when my headlights illuminated a small, rusted mailbox with faded numbers that matched the delivery address. What struck me as odd was that there was no driveway visible, just a narrow footpath disappearing into the trees. I pulled over, leaving my engine running, and checked the app again. The GPS insisted I had arrived. I called the customer, but the call went straight to voicemail. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment and the 3 bags of food from the back seat. The path was barely visible under the fresh snow, but I could make out footprints that seemed recent. I followed them about 200 yards through the woods until they led to a small clearing. There stood a dilapidated Victorian house, the kind you'd see in ghost stories. Unlike the modern homes in town, this one looked like it had been standing since the 19th century. What made it even stranger was that despite the late hour and heavy snowfall, the front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. But not a single light was on inside. I approached cautiously, the weight of the food bags growing heavier with each step. The wooden steps to the porch creaked under my feet, and I called out, "Food delivery." My voice sounded small against the vastness of the surrounding woods. The silence was absolute. No TV, no music, not even the hum of a refrigerator. Just as I was about to leave the food on the porch and get the hell out of there, I heard a voice from the second floor. "We've been waiting for you. Bring it upstairs, would you kindly?" The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, just eerily neutral in a way I couldn't place. A narrow staircase led up from just inside the door, disappearing into complete darkness. "I can leave it here by the door," I offered, my instincts screaming at me not to enter. "No, no," the voice replied, now sounding closer than before. "Come upstairs. We're all up here. We've been so hungry for such a long time." Something about the way they emphasized hungry made my skin crawl. I took one step inside the doorway, and the floorboards groaned beneath me. The air inside was stale and carried an unpleasant, almost sweet odor I couldn't identify. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something on the walls, photographs, dozens of them, all showing different people standing on the same porch where I had just been. In every photo, the person was alone and looking directly at the camera, their expressions unnaturally stiff. Third step creaks, So step over it, the voice instructed, as if I'd already decided to come upstairs. We know all the tricks to this old house. Been here a very long time. I glanced back at my car, its headlights still visible through the trees. The rational part of my brain finally took control. I set the bags down just inside the doorway and backed out onto the porch. Your food is inside the door. Have a good night, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was silence for a moment, then a sound like multiple people moving around upstairs. But we ordered delivery. All of it, the voice said, now clearly coming from the top of the stairs. I could see a silhouette now, unnaturally tall and thin. I didn't respond. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the snow, back toward my car. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the voice call out one last time, "We'll see you again soon." I drove straight to the police station. The officer at the desk listened to my story with increasing concern. When I gave them the address, she exchanged a look with her colleague that made my blood run cold. That house was condemned 20 years ago after the previous owners disappeared, she explained. The county seized it, but nobody's lived there since. We get calls about strange lights and voices every few years, but whenever we check, it's empty. I quit the delivery app that night. 2 weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I looked up the address online. According to county records, the property had been demolished in the 90s. What I had seen shouldn't have been there at all. Sometimes when it snows heavily at night, I think about what might have been waiting at the top of those stairs. And sometimes, when my phone rings with an unknown number around midnight, I wonder if they're still hungry, still waiting for their delivery to be completed. I work at a bowling alley in a small coastal town in Maine. It's one of those family-owned places, nothing fancy, just 12 lanes, a modest snack bar, and a small arcade section with games from the early 2000s. Despite its simplicity, it somehow became a hotspot for locals and tourists alike. Maybe because it was one of the few places open 24 hours, 7 days a week. At least that was the case until last winter. It happened in February, during a particularly harsh winter when I had to take a dreaded overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The place was typically dead during these hours, but that night felt especially desolate. A nor'easter had been battering the coast since before my shift began, with howling winds that rattled the building's old windows and sleet that sounded like thousands of tiny fingernails tapping against the roof. Not a single customer showed up. I spent the first 3 hours meticulously cleaning all the lanes except lane 7, which I kept operational just in case some night owls braved the storm. Through the large front windows, I could see the parking lot completely empty, illuminated only by flickering streetlights. The sleet had turned to heavy snow, creating massive drifts, and I doubted anyone could make it up the hill to our location without four-wheel drive and a death wish. After cleaning, I pulled a stool behind the counter and just sat there, watching the blizzard intensify while listening to the building creak and moan under the storm's assault. There was nothing left to do. The place had no security cameras, and certainly no manager checking in during these ungodly hours. Taking extended breaks, or even catching some sleep on particularly slow nights, wasn't just acceptable. It was an unspoken tradition among night shift workers. Around 2:30 in the morning, seemingly out of nowhere, there came a thunderous crash from the back of the bowling alley. I must have been drifting off when it happened, but I instantly jolted awake, nearly falling off my stool. My heart pounding, I walked toward the back room, telling myself it was probably just the old building settling or something knocked loose by the wind. The back room housed all the pins, bowling balls, and machinery that kept the lanes running. It was essentially a narrow corridor that spanned the entire width of the building behind the pin-setting machines. When I pushed open the heavy door, the room was pitch black. At first, I saw and heard nothing until I looked down. There on the concrete floor was a trail of melting snow, forming distinct footprints. My blood ran cold. "Hello? Anyone back here?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly as I stepped inside. Nothing but silence greeted me, punctuated by the distant rumble of the storm. It took a few minutes for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I noticed something wasn't right. The emergency exit door at the far end of the corridor was slightly ajar, letting in a thin ribbon of night air and snowflakes. That door was always locked. It had to be, as it triggered an alarm if opened improperly. But there was no alarm sounding. As I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing, another loud crash echoed through the space, this time from somewhere deeper within the pin machinery. It sounded like metal striking metal, deliberate and forceful. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and summoning every ounce of courage, I backed away slowly before turning and sprinting toward the front of the building. This wasn't the last time I would find myself in a situation like this, but it was certainly the most terrifying. I raced to the reception desk and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. I tried to wait for the dispatcher's instructions, but the absolute silence of the building, coupled with my paranoia about who or what might be lurking inside, began to suffocate me. The anxiety became so overwhelming that I decided to grab my coat and wait in my car instead. Despite the blizzard conditions, the police arrived surprisingly quickly, within about 8 minutes. The 2 officers, wrapped in heavy winter gear, trudged through the snow with flashlights in hand. Whatever had been following me that night left no trace for them to find. The back emergency door was now firmly closed and locked, as it should have been. The footprints had mostly melted into puddles that could have come from anywhere. And as expected, with no surveillance cameras, there was little evidence to investigate. The officers suggested it might have been another employee playing a prank, or perhaps a homeless person seeking shelter from the storm who fled when they heard me coming. But something about the deliberate nature of those noises, the way the footprints led deeper into the building rather than toward an exit, made me doubt these explanations. After that night, strange occurrences became more frequent during my shifts. Tools moved from where I'd left them, lanes turning on by themselves, the distinct sound of pins being knocked down when all machines were powered off. The owner finally installed security cameras the following month, after several similar incidents were reported by other employees. I never saw footage of what caused those disturbances. 3 weeks after the cameras were installed, I handed in my resignation. Some questions are better left unanswered. The bowling alley changed its hours shortly after I left. It now closes promptly at midnight. It happened in late October, when the leaves had already changed color, and the air was filled with the scent of autumn. I was living in a small town in New Hampshire, known for its picturesque forests and isolated trails. For years I had worked in noisy Boston, and now, after moving, I craved the solitude and peace that only the wilderness could offer. That day the sky was overcast with clouds, promising the first autumn storm. Most people would probably have stayed home, but I had always been a bit eccentric. Bad weather meant fewer tourists on the trails. So I threw my old backpack into the trunk of my pickup and headed to White Mountain State Park, where I usually went when I wanted to truly escape civilization. I parked by a small gravel road that led to the least visited part of the park. The hike to my favorite camping spot took 2 hours, and by the time I finally reached it, dusk was beginning to fall. The air had grown colder, and I felt it filling my lungs, giving me a sense of freedom that was rare in my life. As I was setting up my tent, I noticed the first raindrops falling on the leaves around me. The sound was soothing, almost hypnotic. I quickly gathered dry branches for a campfire, knowing that soon everything around would become too damp. After lighting a fire and preparing a simple dinner of canned food, I decided to climb a small hill nearby to watch darkness envelop the forest. That's when I noticed it, a dim light between the trees, about 300 meters away from me. It was a campfire, much larger than mine, burning brightly even through the fog and intensifying rain. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming another nature lover had decided to stop nearby. However, when I returned to my tent and the rain turned into a real downpour, something began to bother me. I went out again under the cover of my raincoat and looked in the direction of that campfire. It was still burning, even brighter, despite the weather that should have long extinguished it. I took out my binoculars and tried to get a better look. No tents, no people, no signs of a camp, just a huge fire burning in the middle of nowhere. It was impossible. Even if someone had lit it and left, the rain should have extinguished the flames within minutes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. At first, I thought about calling the rangers, but there was no signal in this part of the park. I could have ignored it, crawled into my sleeping bag, and waited until morning. But some part of me felt that would be wrong. What if someone was in trouble? What if the fire spread despite the rain? After 20 minutes of internal struggle, I decided to check it out. Putting on my raincoat and taking a waterproof flashlight, I set off in the direction of the mysterious campfire. The rain was so heavy that even under the trees, I was soaked through within minutes. The only landmark was the light of the fire, which grew brighter as I approached. When I finally reached the clearing where the fire was burning, I was stunned. The flames were almost 2 meters high, burning as if fueled by gas, not wood. No protection from the rain, no traces of people, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the fire had appeared on its own and refused to go out. As I approached closer, I felt an unnatural heat emanating from the fire. It didn't feel normal. It was too intense, almost feverish. I walked around, looking for any signs of who might have lit it, but found only wet ground and soggy leaves. That's when I started to worry in earnest. My father had been a forest ranger, and I grew up knowing how dangerous uncontrolled fires could be. Despite the rain, there was a risk. I decided to put it out. Taking off my backpack, I pulled out a folding shovel and began throwing wet soil onto the flames. At first, it seemed to have no effect, but after several attempts, the fire began to diminish. It took almost 45 minutes, but finally, the last tongues of flame disappeared, leaving only smoldering embers. I stood there wet and breathless, feeling a strange relief. But then something happened that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a distinct whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. He shouldn't have done that. I whirled around, shining my flashlight in all directions. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound confident, but my voice trembled. Silence, only the sound of rain breaking against the leaves. And then, at the edge of the light from my flashlight, I saw a figure. It stood perfectly still, knee-deep in the fog that seemed to wrap around it. "Hey," I shouted again. "Did you light this fire? Don't you know it's dangerous?" No response. The figure just stared at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and appraising. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like prey. "Listen, if you're in trouble, I can help. I have a tent nearby, I have food." And then the figure took a step forward, and my heart nearly stopped. What I saw couldn't be human, at least not entirely. It was too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed unnaturally long. And although I couldn't clearly make out its face, I saw the eyes, two dim lights in the darkness, resembling smoldering embers. I ran, back through the forest, through the rain, stumbling over roots and branches that seemed to reach for me. I didn't look back, but I heard it, quiet footsteps behind me, moving unhurriedly as if knowing I couldn't escape. When I finally reached my tent, I was in such a state that I could barely breathe. I grabbed only the essentials, car keys, phone, flashlight, and decided to head back to the parking area immediately. Fumbling my way in the darkness, now I was constantly looking over my shoulder, sure that it was still pursuing me. The way back seemed endless. 3 times I lost the trail and had to waste precious time finding it again. Finally, when I thought I was lost forever, the gravel road appeared before me, and then my pickup. I practically fell into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as possible, although the road was slippery from the rain. Only when I got to the main highway did I allow myself to relax a little. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in a roadside motel, trembling not from cold, but from what I had seen. I knew I should report it, but what was I supposed to say? That I met something supernatural in the forest, that a fire was burning under pouring rain. They would have thought I was crazy. The next morning, when the storm had subsided, I called the park office and anonymously reported an uncontrolled campfire that I had extinguished, not mentioning the strange figure. They thanked me and said they would send a patrol to check. I returned home and tried to forget what had happened. Went back to work, to my normal life. But every night I dreamed of those smoldering eyes and the whisper. He shouldn't have done that. 2 weeks later, I was overcome with an obsessive desire to learn the truth. I found online forums dedicated to paranormal phenomena and began looking for similar stories. And I found them. Dozens of reports about strange fires in the forests of New Hampshire, especially in the White Mountain area. Some stories dated back centuries, from the time of the first European settlers, who heard from Native Americans legends about fire spirits that lured people deep into the woods. One legend caught my particular attention. It told of a creature called the Keeper of the Flame, a spirit who lit fires in the most remote parts of the forest. According to the legend, these fires were portals between our world and another, and anyone who extinguished such a fire brought eternal pursuit upon themselves. I found contact information for several people who claimed to have had similar experiences, and arranged to meet one of them, an elderly man named Robert who lived in a neighboring town. He invited me to his home, a small house surrounded by dense forest. Robert listened to my story, nodding with understanding, and then showed me his journal, a thick notebook filled with dates, locations, and descriptions. For 30 years, he had been documenting similar encounters, trying to find a pattern. "You made a mistake by putting out the fire," he told me. "Now it knows you. It will find you." I laughed, trying to appear skeptical. "You believe in these old legends." But Robert didn't smile back. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve, showing a long scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. 15 years ago, I did the same thing you did. And since then, it comes to me. Not every night, not every week, but it comes. I returned home even more troubled than before. That night I couldn't sleep, sitting by the window, looking at the dark forest behind my house. And that's when I noticed it, a dim light between the trees, similar to a campfire. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay in the safety of my home. But another part knew that I would never have peace until I confronted what was haunting me. I took a flashlight and went to the forest, feeling my heart beating faster with each step. The fire was exactly as I remembered, too bright, too hot for an ordinary campfire. And there, on the other side of the flames, stood the same figure, waiting for me. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to control my voice. The creature tilted its head, as if examining me. And then I heard that same whisper again, but this time more clearly. "You extinguished my fire. Now you must maintain it." "What does that mean?" I asked, feeling cold sweat running down my back. "Every fire needs a keeper," the creature replied, and I could swear I saw a smile in those smoldering eyes. "Now it's your turn." The next morning, a neighbor found me sleeping beside an extinguished campfire in the forest. I didn't remember how I returned there, or what happened after our conversation. But since then, every night I feel the call of the forest, an irresistible desire to go out and light a fire. And sometimes, when I sit by the campfire I've lit myself, I notice that my hands are becoming longer, thinner, and I see my reflection in the water, eyes glowing like smoldering embers. I don't know if I'm still human or gradually becoming something else. But I know one thing: if you ever see a strange campfire in the forest, burning even in the rain, don't put it out. Just walk away, because some fires should never be extinguished. I decided to rent a lakeside cabin just outside of Pinewood Falls, a small town about 2 hours from the popular ski resort where I usually spend my winter vacations. The resort prices had skyrocketed this season. So many visitors like myself opted for these secluded cabins that offered comfort at a much more reasonable price. It was only the 3rd night of my stay, and I had spent almost the entire day exploring the frozen landscape around the lake. The winter wonderland was breathtaking: snow-covered pines, ice formations along the shore, and occasional wildlife tracks creating patterns across the pristine white blanket. I returned to the cabin around 7 in the evening, earlier than planned, as the temperature had dropped significantly after sunset, making the atmosphere uncomfortably frigid, and the roads increasingly difficult to navigate in my rental car. Upon entering, I immediately cranked up the heating system and lit the old wood stove in the corner for additional warmth. After taking a scalding hot shower to thaw my frozen limbs, I prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. With dinner finished, I settled into the worn leather armchair by the stove, listening to the wind howling outside and watching occasional snowflakes dance past the window. The crackling of the fire and the soft glow it cast around the rustic interior created a perfect atmosphere for the mystery novel I had brought along. But this moment of tranquility was abruptly interrupted when I heard the distinctive crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. This wasn't just the wind blowing snow off the roof or branches creaking under the weight of ice. These were deliberate, measured steps approaching the front porch of the cabin. At first, I waited, expecting someone to knock, but when several seconds passed in silence, I felt a slight unease creep up my spine. I remained still, listening intently, until finally, after what seemed like an eternity, 3 sharp knocks broke the silence. Setting down my book, I approached the door hesitantly. Perhaps because the cabin wasn't mine, I felt a greater responsibility to answer in case something was wrong. When I opened the door, I found a man standing there, possibly in his mid-40s, with a salt and pepper beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. What immediately caught my attention was the flash of surprise that crossed his face when he saw me, as if he hadn't expected someone to actually answer the door. However, this expression vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a practiced smile that didn't quite reach those icy eyes. Not wanting to show my discomfort, I politely asked if he needed something. The man's smile widened strangely, and instead of answering directly, he asked who I was. Finding this odd, I responded with a question of my own. Then, to my surprise, he claimed he had reserved the cabin for the night. Confused, I explained that was impossible since I had booked it for the entire week, and as far as I knew, there had been no errors in the reservation system. I asked to see his confirmation, but he deflected, offering a vague explanation about a possible misunderstanding. By this point, the situation had become distinctly uncomfortable. I was certain my reservation was legitimate, so I simply apologized for any potential mistake and began closing the door. But before I could shut it completely, the man swiftly placed his gloved hand against the wood, preventing me from closing it. With a smile that seemed increasingly forced, he asked if he could come in, just for a few minutes while he sorted out the situation. He explained that it was far too cold to remain outside in the falling snow, though his explanation might have made sense in another context. His behavior made me increasingly uneasy. It wasn't just his insistence on entering, but the way he did it, trying to appear harmless and friendly, while something in his gaze and gestures suggested otherwise. I noticed now that despite claiming to have just arrived, there was no car visible beyond him in the driveway. And though he mentioned the cold, He wore only a light jacket, inadequate for the below-freezing temperatures. These details sent warning signals blaring through my mind. Keeping my voice steady, I firmly stated that I couldn't let him in, wished him good night, and pushed against the door to close it completely. He resisted for just a moment, long enough to make my heart race, before stepping back. I stood in silence for several seconds, just listening. The man didn't immediately leave, which only heightened my concern. He remained there for at least 30 seconds, standing by the door, before I finally heard his footsteps slowly retreating from the cabin. Even more alarmed now, I stayed vigilant, monitoring any sounds from outside. But as nothing else happened in the following minutes, I tried not to panic. I checked that the door was locked, then moved through the cabin, securing all the windows. Only one window in the bathroom had a loose latch, which I wedged shut with a wooden spoon from the kitchen. I returned to the living area and sat on the couch, turning on the television to create background noise while scrolling through my phone and munching on some chips, attempting to forget what had happened and enjoy the rest of the evening. About 2 hours passed, and I was starting to feel drowsy. But suddenly, the man reappeared in my thoughts. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something felt profoundly wrong enough that I set down my phone and approached the window by the door. A sense of dread was building in my chest, a primal warning I couldn't ignore. I peered through the frost-edged glass, watching the outside world carefully. The snowfall had intensified, making the night even darker and colder. But as I shifted my gaze toward the tree line at the edge of the property, I felt an icy chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone was standing between the trees. The distance and darkness made it difficult to see clearly, but the motionless figure amid the forest triggered an immediate fear response. I couldn't say with absolute certainty it was the same man, but all signs pointed to it. The fact that someone was out there in a snowstorm, simply watching the cabin, neither approaching nor attempting to hide, was more than enough to put me on high alert. My heart began racing, and I immediately backed away from the window in case he could see me. I grabbed my phone and called the property management office, explaining the situation. They didn't waste time and immediately contacted the local sheriff's department. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I turned off all the lights in the cabin except for a small lamp in the bedroom, which I left on as I had been doing the previous nights. I wanted him to think I had gone to bed. Instead, I positioned myself in the darkened living room with a clear view of both the front door and the approaching path. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a cast iron skillet from the kitchen, and waited. To my horror, about 15 minutes later, I saw a shadow moving across the porch. The doorknob turned slowly, testing if it was locked. When that failed, the shadow moved toward the windows, systematically checking each one. When he reached the bathroom window with the loose latch, I heard the faint sound of scraping as he worked at the wood. The deputies arrived much faster than I expected, their SUVs silently gliding up the snow-covered access road with their lights off. The property manager must have warned them about the situation. The man noticed their approach only at the last moment and attempted to flee into the woods, but the deep snow slowed him down. When the deputies searched him, they discovered he was carrying a backpack containing various tools typically used for breaking into houses, as well as a hunting knife, and most disturbingly, several zip ties, and a roll of duct tape. My blood ran cold at the realization. It became clear he had never reserved this cabin. It was all a lie to get inside without difficulty, probably hoping to find someone careless enough to let him in without question. The most terrifying part of all, if I hadn't checked before going to sleep, if I had simply ignored that strange feeling I had, if I had dozed off on the couch with the television still playing, I might not be here to tell this story. The deputies later told me they'd been investigating a series of break-ins and assaults at isolated rental properties throughout the region over the past 2 winters. In each case, the perpetrator had first attempted to talk his way inside before resorting to forced entry. I was the first potential victim who had both denied him entry and stayed alert enough to catch him in the act. That night taught me something vital. Always trust your instincts. That uneasy feeling we sometimes get isn't paranoia. It's our subconscious picking up on details our conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. Those instincts have been keeping humans alive for thousands of years, and that night, they may have saved my life. I'm 32 years old and live in a modest cabin just outside a small town in rural Montana. My place sits on the edge of civilization, right where the town's influence fades and the vast wilderness of the national forest begins. The forest stretches for hundreds of miles, a dense maze of pine and aspen that I've always found both beautiful and intimidating. I've made it a habit to hike the narrow trails that wind through the woods near my property. Usually, I don't have time until after sunset, but that's never stopped me from grabbing my headlamp and venturing out alone. There's something calming about the forest at night, the way sounds travel differently, how shadows play tricks on your eyes, the feeling of solitude that's both peaceful and eerie. That particular evening in late October wasn't especially cold. Around 9 o'clock, I pulled on my fleece jacket and headed out for my usual loop. The air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves, and a quarter moon provided just enough light to see the main path. Everything was quiet and still, as it typically is on weeknights when tourists are gone and locals are home. I'd gone about half a mile when I heard something unusual. I stopped and listened, my breath visible in the cool air. I aimed my light toward a thicket of trees off the main path. That's when I saw her, a girl who couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. She was standing absolutely motionless among the trees, wearing what looked like a thin summer dress despite the autumn chill. It was too dark, and she was too distant for me to make out her features clearly, but I could tell she was alone. "Hey there," I called out, keeping my voice gentle. "Are you okay? The trail back to town is this way." She didn't respond or move. I took a few cautious steps in her direction. "Do you need help finding your way back?" Still nothing. I'd hiked these trails hundreds of times, but I'd never ventured far beyond them. The forest grows dense and disorienting quickly, and I've always been wary of getting lost. Seeing this child alone in the darkness triggered immediate concern. I deliberated whether to approach her directly or return to my cabin and call the sheriff. If I left, chances of finding her again would diminish rapidly. So I started walking toward her, keeping my headlamp beam steady. "I can help you get home," I said. "It's not safe out here alone at night." But with each step I took toward her, She took one backward, not frantically like someone running away, but deliberately, methodically, as if she wanted me to follow. Her eyes never left mine, and despite the distance between us, I felt a strange connection, like she was silently communicating with me. Against my better judgment, I followed her deeper into the forest. The trail gradually disappeared beneath my feet, replaced by uneven ground covered with pine needles and fallen branches. The trees grew thicker, blocking out what little moonlight had been guiding us. After what must have been 20 minutes of this strange pursuit, she stopped in a small clearing. Ahead stood a structure I'd never seen before, an old hunting cabin, its logs weathered gray and its roof partially collapsed. In all my years exploring these woods, I'd never stumbled upon this place. The girl stood motionless before the cabin, her pale dress almost glowing in the darkness. I was about to call out again when I heard it, footsteps from inside the structure. Heavy, deliberate footsteps of someone, much larger than the child before me. My stomach tightened with sudden dread. The footsteps approached the cabin door, and I instinctively knew I'd walked into something dangerous. I switched off my headlamp and backed away as quietly as possible, heart pounding in my ears. Once I felt I was at a safe distance, I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches scratching at my face. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, where I immediately called 911. The dispatcher informed me there were no reports of missing children in the area, but promised to send a deputy. Within 30 minutes, a sheriff's vehicle pulled up to my place. Deputy Miller, a man I knew from town gatherings, listened to my story without interruption, though his expression grew increasingly skeptical. "I know how it sounds," I said, "but I know what I saw." He agreed to accompany me back to the cabin. We took his patrol vehicle as far as we could, then hiked the rest of the way with powerful flashlights. I was certain I could find the place again. I'd been so focused on memorizing landmarks during my retreat. But when we arrived at what I was sure was the clearing, there was nothing there. No cabin, no girl, not even signs that a structure had ever stood in that spot. Deputy Miller was kind enough not to suggest I'd imagined the whole thing, but his questions made it clear he doubted my story. We searched the area for almost an hour before giving up. The incident might have remained an unexplained personal experience, if not for what happened 3 months later. The Forest Service was conducting a survey of illegal structures within the national forest boundaries when they discovered an old trapper's cabin, several miles from the location I'd reported, abandoned decades ago, according to their records. What they found inside was never fully disclosed to the public. The local newspaper merely mentioned that evidence related to historical criminal activity had been discovered and turned over to the FBI. Rumors spread through town about items linked to a series of disappearances from the 1970s, but officials remained tight-lipped. A week after the discovery, I received a visit from Agent Parker of the FBI. She interviewed me for over 2 hours about what I'd seen that night. Her questions were detailed and specific, and she seemed particularly interested in my description of the girl. "There's something you should know," she said as she was leaving. "The cabin you described to Deputy Miller that night, right down to the collapsed corner of the roof, matches exactly what we found. But it was in a location 3 miles from where you and the deputy searched. "That's impossible," I said. "I couldn't have made it that far into the forest that night." Agent Parker nodded, her expression unreadable. "There's one more thing." Among the evidence recovered was a photograph from 1972. A family portrait showing a man and woman with their daughter, a girl around 11 or 12, wearing a white summer dress. She didn't elaborate further, but her implication was clear. Either I'd somehow encountered the cabin that night despite its actual location being impossible for me to have reached, or I'd seen something, or someone, that defied logical explanation. I still hike those trails occasionally, though never after dark anymore. Sometimes I wonder about that girl, whether she was luring me into danger that night, or, as I've come to believe, warning me of what lay hidden in those woods. Perhaps she was showing me where to look, guiding me to uncover secrets that had remained buried for nearly 50 years. Whatever the truth, I can't shake the feeling that in those moments when our eyes met across the darkness, she was asking for something, not help for herself, but justice for others. And in a way, that's exactly what she found. It happened last summer during my solo road trip from Colorado to Nevada. I was driving through the desert Southwest, where most of the highways stretch for miles without seeing another soul. Except for the first and last hour of my route, the rest of the journey wound through sandstone canyons, vast desert plains, and eventually into the Sierra Nevada mountains. According to the itinerary I'd mapped out, I knew I'd be driving through the night and well into the next afternoon. I deliberately chose this schedule to avoid wasting 2 full days on the road and paying for an extra night at a motel. I understood it would be exhausting, but I convinced myself it would be worth it. I started my journey around 9 in the evening. After double-checking that I had everything, I arranged snacks and drinks on the passenger seat and set off. The first hour took me through small tourist towns and native reservations, but soon there was nothing but open road, barely any other vehicles in sight. Gas stations appeared maybe every 30 miles at most. 3 hours after setting out, my tank still had some fuel, but since stations were becoming increasingly scarce, I decided to stop at one before venturing into even more remote territory. It took about 15 minutes to find one. The station was completely deserted, a tiny place with only 4 pumps. The convenience store was closed for the night. I began refueling, but the gas flowed frustratingly slow, almost a minute per gallon. I leaned against my car and waited. That's when headlights appeared on the highway. The speed limit was 55 miles per hour, but this car was crawling along at maybe 20. It drove past the gas station entrance, then reversed and pulled in right behind my car at the adjacent pump. I figured the driver had simply missed the entrance and genuinely wanted to refuel. I kept looking straight ahead, listening as someone exited their vehicle and approached their pump. But a minute passed, and I never heard anyone begin fueling or doing anything else. I cautiously turned my head to see what was happening. It was a tall, thin man in a weathered denim jacket and khaki pants, and he was just staring at me. When I looked at him, he was already making direct eye contact. I politely nodded and looked away, but I could feel his gaze still fixed intently on me. After about 15 seconds, I finally heard the sound of the gas pump and felt relieved. deciding I was probably just being paranoid. I waited a bit longer until I decided I had enough fuel, removed the nozzle, and closed my tank. At that moment, I glanced at the man again, and he was still watching me. His expression was unsettling, somehow both vacant and intense, like someone who hadn't slept in days but was hyper-alert. I got into my car and drove off, feeling disturbed, but trying not to make too much of it. About 4 hours later, a dust storm kicked up. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and I'd been driving for 7 hours straight. The reduced visibility forced me to concentrate harder, which only added to my fatigue. I tried an energy drink and some trail mix. Didn't help much. By 2:30, I desperately needed a break, and my fuel gauge was dipping low again. I drove a bit farther and found another gas station. This one seemed even older and just as isolated, but the lights were on. I filled up and parked off to the side of the building, in one of the designated spots. I checked the weather forecast, realized the nearest towns were still distant, and understood I was literally in the middle of nowhere. I decided to take a 45-minute nap to recharge, and hoped the dust storm would pass. I reclined my seat and dozed off. When I woke up, fine particles of sand were still pattering against the windows. My alarm hadn't even gone off. Only 30 minutes had passed. I sat up and peered through the windshield. Everything was quiet except for the wind. But then I noticed a car at one of the pumps. I leaned forward for a better look. It was the same car from the previous station. I was almost certain. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or something sinister was happening. Even stranger, the man was nowhere in sight. It was impossible to tell if he was in the car or somewhere outside. I felt the blood drain from my face. Where had he gone? The place was desolate, with nowhere to hide. I didn't want to stay and find out. I started my car and began backing out. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him. He wasn't behind the car. He was inside it in my back seat, looking directly at me with the coldest, most lifeless eyes I've ever seen. I instantly lunged forward, yanked the door open, and jumped out. The car continued rolling backwards slowly. I hadn't even shifted out of reverse. I sprinted toward a cluster of Joshua trees and desert scrub, but I didn't hear the man getting out. I hid among the vegetation and watched from a distance. The car rolled a few more yards before stopping. After a moment, he climbed into the driver's seat and drove off, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere, without a phone, without a car, without anything. Then it hit me. My phone was still mounted on the dashboard. I stood in the howling wind, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Then I looked at the car the man had left behind. I approached cautiously. The doors were unlocked, keys in the ignition. On the back seat were duffel bags, and thankfully, on the floor by the passenger seat, I found a phone. It was locked, but I was able to use the emergency call feature to contact the police. At the time, I didn't yet grasp the gravity of the situation. I thought the guy was just some opportunistic thief. But then the investigators explained that vehicle had also been stolen. Everything inside belonged to another victim, someone who had experienced the same thing I did, except with a far worse ending. When I spoke with the police, they said the man had likely hidden himself in my car while I was inside paying for gas at some point. He was waiting until we were far out on the highway to reveal himself. And who knows what he intended to do next. They never found him, or my car. What haunts me most isn't just the close call. It's knowing that I was selected, that my routine pit stop became part of someone's calculated plan, that while I was planning my trip, someone else was planning theirs, with me as the destination. The detective later told me they'd linked 3 similar cases across the Southwest, all involving long-distance drivers who disappeared on remote highways. In each case, their vehicles were found abandoned at gas stations, with someone else's stolen car nearby. Sometimes I still drive long distances, but never at night, and I never, ever refuel at empty gas stations anymore. The strangest part is that I occasionally catch myself checking my rearview mirror, looking at the back seat before I get in my car, even in broad daylight, even in crowded places. Because I learned something that night in the desert. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to drop your guard, following patterns you don't even realize you've created. It happened last winter, around mid-December. I live in a modest house on the outskirts of a small town in Montana, surrounded by pine forests and rolling hills, about 45 minutes from the nearest city. The isolation never bothered me before. I'd always found peace in the quiet and the distance from the noise of urban life. That evening I was grading papers. I teach high school English when the power flickered briefly. Nothing unusual during winter storms, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky that night. I made a mental note to check the generator in the morning and continued working. Around 8:30, my phone rang. It was my sister Jessica, calling from out of the blue. She explained that her car had broken down on the highway about 20 minutes from my place, and asked if I could pick her up and maybe grab some dinner on the way back. I was surprised since she rarely visited without notice, but I agreed immediately. This wasn't the first time her ancient Toyota had left her stranded. I put on my heavy wool coat. Temperatures had dropped below freezing that week, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. Just as I pulled it open, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Standing on my porch was a woman, less than 3 feet away from me. She wore a weathered leather jacket and had some kind of dark scarf pulled up over the lower half of her face. The porch light cast strange shadows across her features, making her eyes appear sunken. She didn't flinch or step back despite my startled reaction. She just stood there, perfectly still, as if she'd been expecting me. For a moment, I felt embarrassed by how dramatically I'd reacted. I cleared my throat and asked if I could help her with something, but the woman didn't respond. She simply stood there, staring at me, her eyes never blinking. I asked again if everything was all right, if she needed something. Maybe her car had broken down too, or she was lost. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't just strange anymore, it was becoming terrifying. Her body remained completely motionless, only her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were calculating something. "Look," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. "I'm going to call the sheriff if you don't leave right now." I began closing the door, but in that moment, she took a deliberate step forward. I slammed the door shut and locked it immediately. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I backed away and peered through the side window. The woman was no longer standing on the porch. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and called Jessica back. I told her I couldn't make it, that something had come up. Then I dialed the sheriff's office and reported a suspicious person at my property. They said a deputy would drive by when they could. About 15 minutes passed. I had begun to calm down slightly, convincing myself that maybe she was just a hiker who'd gotten lost, when I heard a sound from the back of the house, coming from the kitchen area. I froze. Someone was gently tapping on my back door. I crept slowly toward the kitchen and peeked through the blinds. It was the same woman. She had somehow known exactly how to circle around to the rear entrance. This wasn't a random encounter. She knew my property. My mind raced with horrible possibilities. I called the sheriff's office again, my voice barely a whisper as I explained that the woman had returned and was now at my back door. The dispatcher instructed me to stay inside, saying that a patrol car was already on its way. I sat in the darkness of my living room, eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway, when another sound caught my attention. This time from a different part of the house, footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway at the side of the property. Whoever this was, she wasn't alone. I heard a faint whisper outside, then what sounded like a metal tool scraping against my bedroom window. I retreated to the hallway closet, wedging myself between winter coats and old boots, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Then something unexpected happened. My phone buzzed with a text message. From Jessica, where are you? I've been waiting for almost an hour. A cold realization washed over me. If Jessica was still waiting for me to pick her up, then who had called me earlier? The sheriff's deputy arrived 23 minutes later. I'd been counting every second. I heard the crunch of tires, a car door slamming, a flashlight beam sweeping across my windows. When I finally emerged from the house with the deputy, there was no one to be found. All that remained were footprints in the frost-covered ground, at least 5 distinct sets. The deputies searched the area, but found nothing except a small notebook dropped near the tree line. Inside were detailed notes about my daily routine, when I left for work, when I returned home, which nights I usually ordered takeout. There were even crude sketches of my house's layout, with windows and doors clearly marked. They told me it was likely an organized attempt at home invasion, possibly even worse. They speculated that the arrival of the patrol car had scared them off. Maybe it was just luck that saved me. Since that night, I've installed a comprehensive security system: cameras, motion sensors, reinforced doors and windows. I've adopted a large German shepherd from the local shelter. I've changed my routines completely, and I never, ever answer unexpected phone calls anymore, because I can still see those eyes through the glass, watching me with cold patience, as if they already knew exactly how everything would unfold. It was the winter of 2011. I was in my junior year of college, working as a night babysitter to pay for my tuition and textbooks. The economy was still recovering from the recession, and jobs were scarce, especially in our small coastal town in Maine. For about 6 weeks, I had been watching a 4-year-old girl named Lily every Thursday night. Her parents, the Morgans, were polite but somewhat reserved. They would usually leave around 7 in the evening, and I'd stay until midnight or so. All I needed to do was make sure Lily stayed asleep and was safe until they returned. Simple enough. That particular night in January was exceptionally cold. A thin layer of snow covered the ground, and the forecast warned of more to come. I arrived at the Morgans' isolated house, a beautiful Victorian home at the end of a winding road, just before 7. Mrs. Morgan greeted me at the door, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Lily's already asleep," she said, pulling on her gloves. "We shouldn't be too late tonight, perhaps around 11. I never asked where they went every Thursday night so consistently. Once Mr. Morgan mentioned something about a support group in the city, maybe grief counseling, or something similar. It wasn't my business to pry. After they left, I set my backpack down in the entryway and did my usual sweep of the house, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The old house creaked and groaned against the winter wind, a sound I'd grown accustomed to. I settled into the armchair in the living room with my laptop. They always told me, make yourself at home, watch TV, help yourself to anything in the kitchen. But typically, I just browsed the internet, occasionally checking on Lily. Less than an hour after they left, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Morgan, her voice slightly distorted by what sounded like wind. "Did you just call me?" she asked, confusion evident in her tone. "No," I replied, equally puzzled. "I'm still at your house. I haven't made any calls." She explained that she'd received a call from an unknown number, but when she answered, there was only silence on the other end. She thought perhaps I was trying to reach her from a different phone due to poor reception. "Everything's fine here," I assured her. "Lily's sleeping soundly." "All right then," she said after a pause. "Must have been a wrong number." I didn't think much of it at the time, figured she was just being cautious. I checked on Lily again, finding her peacefully asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, then returned to the living room. About 30 minutes later, as I was watching a documentary on my laptop, headlights illuminated the front windows. The light filtered through the partially open blinds, casting long shadows across the room. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor returning home. But after several minutes, the headlights remained on, pointed directly at the house. Concerned, I moved to the window and carefully peered out. A dark blue pickup truck was parked on the street in front of the house, its engine still running. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. As I watched, I almost missed the figure standing several yards away from the vehicle, closer to the edge of the driveway. A tall person in what appeared to be a heavy winter coat was simply standing there, staring at the house. My anxiety spiked, but I didn't want to confront them. This wasn't my property after all. I continued observing from behind the curtain. After a minute or so, the figure returned to the truck and got in. What struck me as odd was that they didn't drive away. They just sat there, apparently waiting. I couldn't understand what they were doing, but it made me extremely uneasy. I remained by the window, watching intently, hoping they would leave soon. Several minutes passed, and then the driver's door opened again. The figure emerged and began slowly approaching the house. Panic surged through me, and my mind raced to formulate a plan. Immediately, I called the Morgans, asking them to return home as soon as possible. I didn't try to explain the situation in detail, simply saying that something felt wrong and I didn't feel safe. My hands trembled as I spoke, my heart pounding fiercely in my chest as I kept my eyes fixed on the approaching stranger. When the figure reached the front porch, I saw them carefully glance around before gently knocking on the window. It seemed like they were searching for me. My heart rate accelerated further. I quickly moved away from the window, trying not to make any sound. I was paralyzed with indecision. My only hope was that the Morgans would return quickly. I couldn't leave the house because this person clearly knew I was inside. My thoughts were chaotic, and each moment felt endless. I began considering ways to protect both Lily and myself, but everything seemed implausible and terrifying. After several minutes, I heard a sound at the door, and I froze, ready to act. With surprising speed, I grabbed my phone and tried calling the Morgans again. But when I started speaking, their voice on the other end was faint and confused. They couldn't hear me, and then I realized my phone had somehow malfunctioned. My heart was racing so intensely that I thought I might collapse. What should I do next? Then, unexpectedly, I heard the truck's engine start up. Looking out the window again, I saw the vehicle pulling away, moving very slowly as if still monitoring the house. I watched the headlights disappearing and reappearing between the trees lining the road. But suddenly, they stopped. The lights remained stationary for a while, then went out completely, as if they had parked somewhere down the road and turned off the engine. I considered that perhaps this was someone trying to visit a neighbor who had confused house numbers. Though the whole situation seemed bizarre, I stayed by the window for another 15 minutes. Since the figure didn't return, I decided it might have just been a strange coincidence. I returned to the armchair in the living room and thought about texting the Morgans, but didn't want to worry them unnecessarily. I turned on the television, keeping the volume very low to avoid waking Lily. After a few minutes, I went back to the window and opened the blinds slightly, still thinking about the incident. An hour or two passed without further disruption. I remained in the living room with the TV on, fighting against drowsiness. My eyelids grew heavy, and I noticed I was drifting off with my eyes half open and my mind disconnected. In this semi-conscious state, I heard a faint sound like a scraping noise. It didn't fully wake me, but then I heard it again. I became fully alert and stood up. I wasn't sure what it was, but I decided to check on Lily. Walking down the hallway, I heard the sound again and caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. I turned my head. Someone was at the back door, pulling on the handle and looking directly at me through the glass panel. The moment they noticed I'd seen them, they began yanking the handle more forcefully, attempting to break in. My nerves were shattered, and I ran upstairs, carefully lifted Lily from her bed, trying to keep her calm as she stirred from sleep. While on the upper floor, the sounds grew louder. It seemed the intruder was using something to force the door open. With Lily in my arms, I descended the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I heard another sound, like plastic and metal breaking. I ran through the hallway toward the front door, but saw that the back door was already open, and the figure was entering the house. The intruder wore dark clothing and had a scarf wrapped around the lower half of their face. That's all I could discern before noticing something metallic in their hand. Without hesitation, they lunged toward me. I fled from the house, managed to secure Lily in my car, and drove away as fast as I safely could. I reached the town's 24-hour diner, called the police, and then the Morgans. By the time authorities arrived at the house, the intruder was gone. Based on everything that happened, I believe they intended to frighten me, or worse, to abduct Lily. But what perplexed me most was how they could have known the parents would be absent that specific night, and why they targeted this particular child. The strangest part of all was that after this incident, the Morgans gradually distanced themselves from me. They expressed gratitude that night, but never hired me again. I got the impression they didn't want me to discover what had really happened. I conducted my own investigation, but found little information. The only thing I learned was that Mrs. Morgan had previously been married to someone who vaguely resembled the intruder I saw that night. But it's difficult to confirm with certainty. I can only speculate. 3 years have passed, and whenever I drive by that old Victorian house, now occupied by a different family, I still feel a chill. Sometimes when my phone rings from an unknown number, I hesitate before answering. I suppose we may never know the full truth, but I've never worked as a night babysitter since then. It was just an ordinary day in late autumn. I returned from my shift at the tech startup around 4 in the afternoon, then met up with a couple of friends at a local brewery in downtown Portland. We hung out until about 10 in the evening before I headed back to my apartment. My sister, who shares the place with me, had already left for her overnight shift at the hospital where she works as an ER nurse. The building was completely silent, just me, my thoughts, and the comfort of my gaming console. Since I needed to wake up early the next morning for an important client meeting, I couldn't stay up too late. I prepared my lunch for work first, then sprawled out on the couch for 15 minutes to play a quick round of Call of Duty and unwind a bit before bed, hoping it would help me fall asleep more easily. To be honest, I was so exhausted that the moment my head hit the pillow, I was out cold. However, a few hours later, I jolted awake, heart racing, and glanced at my smartwatch. It was 2:30 in the morning. I've always hated waking up at this hour. It's like my brain decides it's done with sleep for the night. Nevertheless, I tried to get comfortable on my pillow again, closed my eyes, and hoped to drift back to sleep. That's when I heard the front door open. Initially, I assumed it was my sister returning home, which struck me as odd since she wasn't supposed to be back until 7 in the morning. But I figured maybe she forgot something and had quickly stopped by the apartment. Soon enough, fatigue took over again, and I fell back asleep. When I woke up, it was time to get ready for work. I got up, gathered my things, and went to the refrigerator to grab the lunch I had prepared the night before. To my surprise, it was gone. I concluded that my sister must have taken it. It was too late to make something else, so I headed to work, resigning myself to overpriced takeout for lunch. Not ideal, but I had no other choice. Returning home that evening, I noticed my sister hadn't come back yet. I planned to talk to her later and ask her not to take food from the bottom drawer, explaining that those were my packed lunches, and I preferred not to eat out frequently. I spent nearly an hour cleaning the kitchen and preparing what I'd take for the next day. Then I dozed off on the couch and woke up around 8 in the evening. I saw that my sister had come home, but had gone back to the hospital for an extra shift. I decided to heat up some leftover Thai food for dinner and retreated to my room to watch a movie, just to pass the time. As usual, I fell asleep before the movie ended, but woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. It was almost 3 a.m. when I heard the front door close. Thinking my sister had returned early again, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and sent her a message asking her not to touch my food. The truth was, I was too tired to get up and talk to her, and I knew if I did, it would be even harder to fall back asleep afterward. So I remained lying there, experiencing a strange mixture of exhaustion and unease, waiting for things to return to normal. Then I received a reply from her, just a question mark. She had no idea what I was talking about. I didn't want to argue via text, so despite my irritation, I decided to get out of bed and go to the kitchen to speak with her in person and ask her not to take my food. But to my surprise, she wasn't there. Realizing she wasn't in the kitchen, I went to the living room to see if she was on the couch. And that's when everything spiraled out of control. Sitting in one of our armchairs was a man I had never seen before in my life. He had a patchy beard, disheveled gray hair, and eyes that were completely hollow, as if he wasn't entirely present in this world. I froze at the sight. In front of him was a pile of food he had clearly taken from our refrigerator and pantry. And then the man turned, and our eyes met. Neither of us said a word for several seconds, but suddenly he stood up, and that's when I noticed he was holding something in his hand. My heart stopped when I realized it was a hunting knife with a worn wooden handle. I was completely shocked, immobile for a few seconds, until I saw him raise the knife and point it directly at me with that same empty, emotionless gaze. I remember this moment in excruciating detail, as if time had stopped. Now I understand why they use slow motion effects in movies. That's exactly what you feel when you think you're about to die. Adrenaline surged through me, and my body moved on instinct. I lunged sideways, and I swear I could see the precise moment when his body tensed to lunge forward. The sound of the chair scraping against the hardwood floor echoed in my ears as I scrambled across the floor. Then I rushed toward the door, praying it would be unlocked. Thankfully it was, and within seconds, I had flung it open and bolted out like a madman down the hallway, screaming for help and praying someone would be awake. When I burst into the corridor, I looked back to see if he was following me. To my astonishment, the man was still standing in the doorway, knife in hand. And that's when he started walking calmly toward me, and I thought, this is it, I'm going to die. In a panic, I did something I'd never done before. I pulled the fire alarm on the wall. I'm certain that's what saved my life. As the blaring alarm filled the building, I sprinted toward the emergency stairwell, while the man continued his deliberate pace behind me. Doors began to open as confused residents emerged from their apartments, and the man suddenly stopped, seemingly disoriented by the growing crowd and noise. I continued running down the stairs, since my phone was still in my room, and I had no way to call for help. When I reached the lobby, I could hear sirens approaching. My eyes filled with hope as I saw police cars pulling up outside our building, responding to the fire alarm. I practically threw myself at the first officer I saw and began explaining everything in a frantic rush. When the police entered our apartment, the man was still there, now sitting calmly on the couch, the knife resting on the coffee table in front of him. The most terrifying part was that he made no attempt to escape or resist. He had that same vacant stare, as if he existed in another realm entirely. He didn't say a single word, just raised his hands and allowed himself to be handcuffed. But without a doubt, what horrified me most was the look he gave me as they arrested him. Those cold, empty eyes never left mine for a moment, until the elevator doors closed between us. I stood there, stunned, watching him being taken away, with cold fear coursing through my veins because of that chilling gaze. And all I could think was that I had encountered a true psychopath. We later learned that this man had entered our apartment several times during the night without breaking any locks. He had a key, and neither my sister nor I had any idea how he had obtained it. We immediately changed all the locks, just imagining that he could have entered my room while I was sleeping and killed me there, as he had attempted to do in the living room, made me physically ill. If I hadn't woken up, my sister would have been next when she returned from her shift. This thought filled me with genuine terror. Days passed, but the fear remained. Every unusual sound accelerated my heartbeat. My sister and I decided to enhance our home security, installing cameras and more robust locks. That night, I realized that even the safest place could be infiltrated by someone unknown and dangerous. The sense of security I had once felt vanished completely. And even though that man is now behind bars, the fear that he might return and try again stays with me to this day. It's been 3 years, and I seriously doubt this fear will ever disappear. What haunts me most, though, is what the detective told me during the investigation. They found a journal in the man's motel room with detailed notes about our movements, our schedules, what food we liked. He had been watching us for weeks before making his move. And there was something else, photographs of other people, other apartments, with dates and times meticulously recorded. They think he may have been responsible for a string of mysterious disappearances across 3 states. Sometimes I wonder if I was just one entry in his journal, or if there was something specific about me that caught his attention. I don't think I'll ever know, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Every night before bed, I check every window, every door, every shadow in my apartment. My therapist says it's PTSD, that it will get better with time. But some nights, when I jolt awake at 2:30 in the morning for no reason, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a key turning in a lock, and those hollow eyes are waiting for me in the darkness. Hi there. My name is Valerie. I'm 20 years old, and this story happened when I was 17. I was living in a rural area just outside of Portland, Oregon, in a house surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. It was mid-November, and a heavy rain had been falling for days. My parents had driven to Seattle to visit some old friends they'd known since before we moved west from Chicago. They planned to stay there for the weekend. My older brother, Elijah, was away at college in California, so I had the house to myself. It was Friday evening, and my best friend, Tyler, was supposed to come over and stay the weekend to keep me company. At the last minute, though, his car broke down on the highway, and he had to get it towed to a garage. He texted me that he wouldn't be able to make it until tomorrow at the earliest. To be honest, I wasn't particularly nervous about being alone. Since I was 13, I'd gotten used to having the house to myself occasionally. I'd spent plenty of nights alone without any problems. That's not to say I loved being by myself at night, especially in our somewhat isolated location. But it didn't make me panic either. Tyler texted me around 10 at night to let me know he'd made it home safely. And I messaged my mom that my plans had changed and I was on my own. She replied right away, telling me to be careful, set the alarm system, and keep my phone charged. The usual mom stuff when she's worried. I immediately activated our home security system and went to my parents' bedroom, which had the biggest TV in the house, with all the premium streaming channels that my room didn't have. I stretched out on their bed and started browsing Netflix. My dog Luna, a golden retriever mix, curled up beside me, which made me feel safer as I searched for something to watch. I had just settled on a movie when suddenly the alarm went off with a piercing wail. I jumped off the bed, my heart racing. This had never happened before. I looked at the alarm panel by the door and saw red lights flashing. The sound was deafening, and it took me about 15 seconds to gather my thoughts. This couldn't be a system malfunction. Something or someone had triggered the alarm. All the doors were locked, and only my family and Tyler had keys to the house. I'd given him one so he could stay over. But I knew it couldn't be my brother because he was hundreds of miles away. And not Tyler, since he just texted that he was home. My parents were still in Seattle. I thought about all my other friends, but everyone was either busy or out of town. None of this made any sense. I stood frozen on the bed for those 15 seconds, which felt like an eternity. Then I got up, went to my parents' bedroom door, closed it, and locked it from the inside. I didn't want to turn off the alarm, because I knew that in 1 minute it would automatically call the security company, who would dispatch the police. Besides, the noise would scare away anyone who had broken in. Despite this, I went to my father's dresser and took out the gun he always kept for emergencies. I'm nearly 5 feet 11 inches tall, and I've been taking martial arts classes for years. So I knew I could defend myself if someone with bad intentions was in the house. But I didn't want to take any chances. I grabbed the gun, checked that it was loaded, switched off the safety, and aimed it at the door, keeping my finger off the trigger as I'd been taught, until I was sure I needed to shoot. It was surreal holding a loaded gun, imagining that someone might be outside the door. I felt like I was in a horror movie. We always hear about break-ins on the news, but you never think it could happen to you. Yet there I was, terrified, holding a gun to protect myself in my own home. I stood there for I don't know how long, trying to mentally prepare myself to pull the trigger if necessary. I tried to stay calm, quiet, and alert. That moment seemed eternal, but it was probably just a few minutes. The alarm was still blaring, and I decided to call 911 just in case the system had malfunctioned. I explained everything to the dispatcher, who stayed on the line until 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. They searched the perimeter of the house before knocking on the door. When I was sure it was them, I turned off the alarm, hid the gun, and went to meet them. They said there were no signs of forced entry outside and no indication of intruders. They asked me a few questions, and I told them everything. They asked if I wanted them to check inside the house, and to this day, I regret saying no. They said they would continue patrolling the area and that I could call if needed. I thanked them, walked them to the door, and as soon as they left, I returned to my parents' bedroom. I tried to calm Luna, who was clearly not much of a guard dog. When everything seemed quiet again, I called my parents and told them what had happened. My father, always composed, didn't panic, and I think that's why I can be so level-headed too. My mother, on the other hand, was clearly panicking, almost hysterical, asking if I was okay, if I wanted them to come home immediately. I said it wasn't necessary, that the alarm had probably scared off whoever it was, and everything was fine now. Only after I hung up did I realize I hadn't reset the alarm. A major oversight. I went to the panel, entered the code, and pressed the button, but nothing happened. I panicked for a moment, until I remembered the alarm only works if all doors are properly closed. My heart sank. This meant I would have to check the entire house to find which door was left open. At that moment, I realized how careless I'd been to refuse the deputy's help. I went back to my parents' bedroom, took the gun again, and mentally prepared for the worst. I went downstairs with the gun in my hands and started checking each door. When I reached the hallway and saw the door to the basement, I noticed it was wide open. A chill ran down my spine. It was entirely possible that someone could have entered through the small basement windows, which made me even more nervous. I switched on the basement light and aimed the gun, scanning the windows for any signs of intrusion. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something odd. The old chest freezer in the corner, which we rarely used anymore, had its lid propped open slightly. It should have been completely closed. With my attention focused on the freezer, I didn't notice the figure moving in the shadows behind the furnace. As I approached the freezer, gun trained on it, someone suddenly lunged at me from behind. It happened so fast I couldn't react. I fell to the ground, and a man landed on top of me, covering my mouth with one hand and grabbing my wrist with the other, the wrist of the hand holding the gun. During the struggle, I managed to fire a shot, but I missed. He was stronger and managed to wrench the gun away from me while pinning me to the floor. There wasn't much I could do from that position. I got a better look at his face, a thin man with a scraggly beard and dirty, long hair. He smelled terrible and looked homeless. As soon as he took the gun, he pointed it at my face and said in a raspy voice that if I screamed, it would be the end for me. At that moment, I truly panicked. His eyes were bloodshot and darting around strangely. He got off me, kept the gun aimed, and dragged me upstairs, where he tied me up and gaped my mouth on the living room couch. Then he went upstairs to the bedrooms and began stealing everything he could carry, stuffing items into a pillowcase. I remained tied to the couch, not knowing how much time had passed. It felt like forever. While I was there, I couldn't stop thinking about what he would do to me after he finished robbing us. But I got my answer when he was done. He looked through the window to make sure no one was around. It was about 3 a.m, and the neighborhood was silent. The rain had intensified, drumming heavily on the roof. Then something unexpected happened. As he was preparing to leave, his phone rang. The sudden noise startled both of us. He fumbled to silence it, but not before I heard a woman's voice on the other end. He turned away from me and spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at me. From the fragments I could hear, it seemed like someone was waiting for him. After ending the call, he stood there for a moment, looking conflicted. Then, to my shock, he set the gun down on the coffee table, just out of my reach, and said, "I'm not what you think. I'm sorry about this." His voice sounded different now, less threatening. He walked to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. He removed my gag and helped me drink. "I can't untie you," he said, "but someone will find you by morning." I made sure of it. Before leaving, he placed my phone on the table next to the gun and did something I'd never have expected. He triggered the alarm again. As the siren began to wail, he slipped out the front door and disappeared into the rainy night, taking the pillowcase full of my family's valuables with him. I was left tied up, but now with the alarm blaring. Within minutes, the security company called, and when no one answered, they dispatched the police again. The same deputies arrived about 20 minutes later and found me bound on the couch. They freed me immediately and called for backup to search the area. But the intruder was long gone. He had escaped with all my mother's jewelry, my father's watch collection, our laptops, tablets, and various other valuables. Strangely, he'd left the gun behind. We were deeply shaken by what had happened, but deep down, we were grateful that he had only stolen things and hadn't harmed me. We understood it could have been much worse. After this incident, my parents substantially reinforced our home security. In addition to the alarm system, they installed motion sensors, cameras in every room, and replaced the locks with more sophisticated models. They also hired a company to monitor our home 24 hours a day to ensure we would never be so vulnerable again. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. Any noise made me jump out of bed, and I kept reliving the moment when he jumped on me. I experienced this almost every night. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and had to undergo therapy for several months to return to a normal rhythm of life. Tyler became a huge support during this time. He visited me almost every day, accompanied me to therapy sessions, and even stayed at my house so I wouldn't be alone. My mother also became much more protective after what happened. What still haunts me to this day is trying to understand the man who broke in. Why did he trigger the alarm before leaving? Was it a moment of conscience, ensuring I would be found quickly? Or was there something more calculated behind his apparent act of mercy? The deputies told me later that several similar break-ins had occurred in neighboring counties. But in none of the other cases had the intruder shown any compassion toward the victims. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see his face again, not because I want revenge, but because I want to ask him why. Why did he choose our house? And why, in that final moment, did he choose to help me? These are questions I may never have answers to, but they're always there, lingering in the back of my mind whenever I hear an unexpected noise in the night. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.